Here's the Harry Truman Good Neighbor Award Foundation, presented to John Hope Franklin, PhD, on May 7 today. Congratulations, and we're delighted to honor you, sir. You're a wonderful guy.
Thank you, Mr. Pastelli, Mr. Fogel, members of the dais, ladies and gentlemen of Kansas City and its environs. I do not have the capacity to express to you my great pleasure and my honor in receiving the Harry Truman Good Neighbor Award on this occasion. I'm especially pleased that the award is the occasion for the dispensing of scholarships to persons whose field of international studies will give them a place not only at our table, but at the tables around the world as they undertake to extend the spirit of good neighborliness wherever they go. For the better part of a decade, I served on the Board of Foreign Scholarships, commonly known as the Fulbright Board, and I have therefore a particular pleasure in commending these institutions for promoting international goodwill, and to the students for their role in studying international relations and promoting through their studies the good neighbor policy. The importance of learning to live together in peace, and we are to share the natural and human resources of the planet Earth, there's no more important task than to do this. It is a wonderful experience for me to have the recognition of the Truman Foundation, for Harry Truman was indeed a good neighbor, not only to his immediate friends around and in Independence and Kansas City, but to his friends around the world. Permit me to say that I have been an admirer of President Truman for more than a half century. I liked the positions that he took when he was in the United States Senate. And when he was nominated for the vice presidency, I was overjoyed. As an Oklahoma native, I thought that Truman's road to the White House would give us in Oklahoma virtual representation. That's about as close as we've been to the White House up to this point. Now, my admiration for the president did not lead me to believe that he could defeat Thomas Dewey in 1948. From the time that I could vote, and that was in 1936, my father and I exchanged presidential election predictions before each election. And in 1948, we exchanged our traditional letters. And I wrote to my father that Dewey would win the presidency, perhaps, unfortunately, in a landslide. Whereupon my father predicted that Truman would win. And when he wrote me that, I whipped a letter back to him admonishing him to stop following his heart and give his head a break for a change. He shot back to me that I should stop following the pollsters and yield to common sense and good reason for a change. As you can well imagine, I dined on crow morning, noon, and night on the Wednesday following the 1948 election. As I reflected on the life and times of President Truman, I also reflected on the conditions at the time that he was vice president and then president, and the conditions that we who were living then all confronted. When the war came, and after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the Navy put out an urgent call for petty officers to fill the void left by the officers who had gone to substitute for those who had been casualties in the field, not only at Pearl Harbor, but in various other parts of the Pacific. And as they were called to active duty in their various stations at sea, the newspapers in the United States issued desperate calls for volunteers. That was in early 1942, and I was teaching at a small African-American college in Raleigh, North Carolina. I wanted to serve, and I went to the recruiting station, volunteering my services, and the recruiting officer, who was a lieutenant junior grade in the Navy, asked me what I could do. They wanted office men, and I emphasized my skills and talents as a possible candidate for office duty. And I said that I could type. I had 3 gold medals in typing. And I said that I could do shorthand. I had a skill of about 145 words a minute as a shorthand stenographer. I told them that I had managed the office of the librarian at the college where I had studied for 4 years. And I added, somewhat belatedly and somewhat reluctantly, that I also had a PhD in history from Harvard University. And he said, "You have everything but color." And I apologize for taking up his time. I spent most of the next 4 years trying to stay out of the war that I felt did not deserve me. And the riots on and off the bases, the frequent summons that I got from my draft board, and the persistence of segregation and discrimination confirmed my conviction that there was something wrong with a country that undertook, on the one hand, to keep its priorities straight, and that wasted so much of its time and its energy and its manpower trying to maintain a biracial society that was not equal in any respect. A sergeant told my brother that he would spend his time in the Army seeing to it that my brother, who was the principal of a high school and an honor graduate from Fisk University, seeing to it that my brother did nothing better than peel potatoes. No wonder Mrs. Roosevelt said in the midst of the war that blacks could not be expected to strive to serve willingly as long as these conditions persisted. It was at the end of the war, almost the end of the war, in the spring of 1945, that I was traveling from Greensboro, North Carolina, to Durham, North Carolina by train. President Clinton told this story in the East Room of the White House when I was being presented the Presidential Medal of Freedom. And President Clinton said that I was crowded on a train, the half coach, with some 40 or 50 other African Americans, and that we were trudging our way back to Durham from Greensboro, and that we noticed that on the coach behind us were 6 white men enjoying a full coach with a seat on which they could put their feet in front of them as they sat in one coach and one seat, and as enjoying themselves also as they looked at us in the next car, huddled together, shoulder to shoulder, some sitting on the floor, some sitting on bags, some sitting on seats, and they were enjoying our displeasure. And when I said to the conductor as he came through, wending his way, collecting the tickets, I said to him that if you will exchange us, I'm not asking for any kind of integration or anything, if you will just let us sit back there where those 6 white men are sitting, and let them come up here where we are sitting, everyone will have a seat and be comfortable. And the conductor said to me that I cannot move them. They are German prisoners of war. And President Clinton said that Franklin was a prisoner of American racism. The racial conflicts in American cities, as well as on the bases, persisted at the close of World War II. And as a result, Washington and elsewhere were blatant examples of segregation and discrimination. That blacks could not perform in the Constitution Hall. Blacks could not attend the National Theater. Anywhere that President Truman looked out of the window of the White House, in any direction, he saw nothing but blatant discrimination and segregation and humiliation. And there were only 2 places. Perhaps he could not see them quite from the White House, but there were 2 places in Washington, D.C. where a person could get a meal within walking distance, where a black person could get a meal within walking distance of the Library of Congress. I know that only too well because I went to the Library of Congress every day in the fall of 1946 and 7. And one day when I was in my study room at the library, C. Van Woodward, one of the most distinguished historians of the country, was teaching then at the Johns Hopkins University, and who now is a Sterling Professor of History Emeritus at Yale University. Van came by my study room and said, "Look, John Hope, let's have lunch tomorrow." We hadn't had lunch in quite some time. I said, "Fine." Then I remembered that tomorrow was Saturday. The Supreme Court restaurant would be closed. The Methodist Building restaurant would be closed. There was nowhere within walking distance of the Library of Congress that we could have a meal together. And I said, "Van, we'll have to postpone our meal until next summer, next week, for we can't eat anywhere together tomorrow." And he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Aren't you coming to the library tomorrow?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Are you coming to the library Sunday?" I said, "Yes, by all means. I come every day." And he said, "What do you do for meals on Saturday and Sunday?" I said, "Well, I bring a sandwich, or a piece of fruit, or a piece of candy. I come a little late on Saturdays and Sundays, and I struggle through the day with my pittance of a meal. And when the pangs of hunger get me so much that I can stand them no longer, I go home for a slightly early dinner." And he said to me, he said, "Look, if I had to go through that to be a historian, I don't think I'd want to be one." And I said, "To endure the pangs of hunger for a few hours is only one of the minor inconveniences that an Afro-American has to experience in struggling to be a historian or anything else." Now, the president was sensitive to all this, as no president before him had been sensitive to it. He had watched the violence, the riots, the attacks on black soldiers. He had noticed that there had been no black soldier who had received the Medal of Honor, despite their valor, even in World War I, even in World War II. And he was especially displeased at the treatment of them. And he spoke out against it. I remember so well hearing him at the university commencement at Howard University in the summer of 1952. when he was the president, and when he spoke out against segregation in the Army, and when he called on equality of education, equality of military service, and all the rest. There had been no president of the United States who had ever spoken out against segregation of any form, in any way, until President Truman came to the White House. You might think that President Roosevelt had spoken out against it, but he had not. You might think that Wilson had spoken out against it when he spoke of the four freedoms, but when he spoke of the 14 points, but no, he had not spoken out against it. No president of the United States had ever spoken out against racial segregation until Harry Ship Truman spoke out against it. He not only spoke out against it, he did something about it. He was the first president of the United States to appoint a commission to study the question and to bring in recommendations. He appointed a distinguished blue ribbon committee in the summer of 1947. And they brought in a report after studying it for some time. They brought in a report in less than a year, in 1947, a report known by its title, To Secure These Rights. And they went down the line, calling for equality in education, calling for an end to violence in the armed service, calling for equality in military service, calling for equality in all phases of public life, and calling for an end to segregation. That was a landmark report made by a landmark president, calling for a revolution, so far as this nation was concerned, in human and social relations. And despite the fact that we would soon forget that and we would become like criminal recidivists as we move sliding back into the old ways, that we would have to be reminded over and over and over again in the next generation of what the President of the United States stood for in 1946 and 1947. And we would be hard put not only to exceed what he demanded, but even to live up to what he demanded. And this is what we want to remember the President of the United States doing as we sit here to commemorate him today. That he was a man who believed in equality, not only of opportunity, but equality of persons. He believed that no human being was better than another human being. And he sought to inject that policy in his own administration. And when he appointed that committee that came up with To Secure These Rights, it set a benchmark for you and me to follow. If we went back even in 1940, in 1999, if we went back to study To Secure These Rights, to say nothing of the recommendations that my board and I made to the President this year, if we went back and merely said, Mr. President, take To Secure These Rights and follow them, we would be in a much better position than we are today, and we could look forward to a great tomorrow. I commend To Secure These Rights for you. I commend the memory of President Truman to you. I commend his program and platform in race relations to you. As we think about these things and as these young people go back to their respective countries to teach what I hope will be the good neighbor policy, I hope that you will then return back and come back to us and teach us something about the good neighbor policy. We still have much to learn, but we ought to be good students. I hope we are. Thank you very much.